3 in the morning, January 31st, 1968. The explosion rips through the night air as 19 Viet Cong sappers blow a hole in the wall of the most secure building in South Vietnam, the United States Embassy in Saigon. American military police trapped inside radio desperately for backup as automatic weapons fire echoes through the compound. Bodies scatter across the manicured embassy grounds. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Tet ceasefire was in effect. The enemy was defeated, broken, on the run. But here they were, fighting and dying in America's most protected sanctuary. This single night would shatter everything Americans believed about the Vietnam War. Just months earlier, General William Westmoreland stood before Congress painting a picture of imminent victory. "The enemy's hopes are bankrupt," he declared with absolute confidence. The light at the end of the tunnel was finally visible. 500,000 American troops had established overwhelming firepower superiority. B-52 bombers dropped more ordnance on Vietnam than all of World War II. Artillery bases dotted the countryside like concrete fortresses. The technology gap between American forces and black pajama guerrillas seemed insurmountable. Intelligence reports flowing into the Pentagon painted the Viet Cong as a spent force. Enemy troop movements were dismissed as desperate defensive repositioning. When North Vietnamese units began massing near major cities, American commanders interpreted it as preparation for conventional battles they were certain to win. The American public, though growing weary of the endless war, still trusted their military leaders. Opinion polls showed cautious optimism about progress. Sure, the nightly news brought disturbing images from the jungle, but the experts promised it would all be over soon. In Saigon, American officials prepared for the most peaceful Tet holiday in years. The traditional Vietnamese New Year ceasefire would give everyone a break from the fighting. Embassy staff planned parties. Military advisors took leave. The South Vietnamese army relaxed its guard. What they didn't know was that the enemy had spent months infiltrating their cities. Weapons caches lay hidden in urban neighborhoods. Communist agents had mapped every government building, every military installation, every symbol of American power. While Americans celebrated their approaching victory, General Vo Nguyen Giap was orchestrating the most audacious military operation in Vietnamese history. 70,000 fighters would simultaneously attack over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The goal wasn't territorial conquest, it was psychological destruction. The North Vietnamese had studied American psychology as carefully as American tactics. They understood that the United States was fighting two wars, one in the jungles of Southeast Asia and another in the living rooms of America. Win the second war, and the first would end itself. Ho Chi Minh's strategy had always been about patience. Americans thought in terms of quarterly reports and election cycles. Vietnamese communists thought in terms of generations. They could afford to lose every battle as long as they eventually won the war. The Tet holiday provided perfect cover. Thousands of fighters disguised themselves as holiday travelers, flooding into cities where they had never operated before. Local Viet Cong cells activated sleeper agents who had lived normal lives for years, waiting for this moment. American intelligence agencies focused on the remote firebase at Khe Sanh, where 20,000 North Vietnamese troops had surrounded 6,000 Marines, missed the urban buildup entirely. Westmoreland became obsessed with defending Khe Sanh, convinced it was the enemy's main objective. The stage was set for the most shocking reversal in American military history. Everything the Pentagon had told the public about enemy capabilities was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The confident predictions of victory would transform overnight into desperate explanations of how the supposedly defeated enemy had penetrated America's most secure installations. In just a few hours, the optimistic briefings and body count statistics would collide with televised reality. The credibility gap between official reports and battlefield facts was about to explode into a chasm that would swallow an entire presidency and change how Americans viewed their government forever. The calm before the storm was ending. The enemy America had underestimated was about to teach the world's most powerful military a lesson in the psychology of warfare. Every evening at 6:30, America gathered around their television sets for the most trusted ritual in the country. Walter Cronkite's familiar face filled living rooms from coast to coast as the CBS Evening News delivered the day's most important stories. Uncle Walter had earned that nickname through decades of steady, authoritative reporting. When Cronkite spoke, America listened. His credibility was unshakable, the kind of moral authority that came from covering World War II, the Kennedy assassination, and the space program with unwavering professionalism. In 1968, the CBS Evening News reached 20 million viewers every night. That was more than any other single source of information in American history. Families planned their dinner schedules around Cronkite's broadcast. Children grew up thinking his voice was the sound of truth itself. For 3 years, Cronkite had dutifully reported the Vietnam War with the same objective tone he brought to every story. He read Pentagon casualty figures. He showed footage of American soldiers in action. He interviewed generals who spoke confidently about progress and momentum. The evening news format perfectly suited the military's information strategy. Correspondents in Saigon attended daily briefings where officials presented carefully selected statistics. Body counts showed enemy losses mounting. Maps displayed territory under government control. Charts tracked weapons captured and villages pacified. Television brought the war into American homes, but it was a sanitized version of combat. Network executives worried about showing too much violence during dinner hour. Correspondents relied heavily on military escorts and official sources. The Pentagon controlled access to combat zones and transportation to story locations. Most Americans had no other way to understand what was happening 8,000 miles away. Newspapers provided more detailed analysis, but television delivered immediate emotional impact. When Cronkite said the war was going well, families with sons in Vietnam felt reassured. When he reported enemy setbacks, they believed victory was approaching. The credibility gap was already growing by late 1967, though few Americans recognized it yet. Pentagon briefings in Saigon became known as the 5 o'clock follies among experienced war correspondents. Officials presented optimistic assessments that often contradicted what reporters witnessed in the field. But those contradictions rarely reached the evening news. Network television needed simple narratives that could be explained in 2-minute segments. Complex stories about political corruption in South Vietnam or civilian casualties from American bombing didn't fit the format. The war became a series of discrete battles with clear winners and losers. Cronkite himself had visited Vietnam in 1965 and returned convinced that American involvement was necessary and winnable. His personal credibility became intertwined with support for the war effort. When he reported progress, it carried the weight of his own first-hand observations. American families trusted Cronkite more than they trusted politicians. Polls consistently showed that television news anchors ranked higher in public confidence than presidents or congressmen. In a democracy where citizens needed accurate information to make informed decisions, Walter Cronkite had become the most powerful man in America. The evening news created a shared national experience. Families across the country watched the same footage, heard the same analysis, and formed similar opinions about distant events. Television was unifying American public opinion in ways that had never been possible before. But that unity depended on the accuracy of the information being broadcast. If the official sources were wrong, if the Pentagon briefings were misleading, if the optimistic assessments were false, then television's power to shape opinion would work in reverse. The medium that had built support for the war could just as easily destroy it. All it would take was a single dramatic event that contradicted everything Americans had been told. Something so shocking, so undeniable, that even the most trusted voice in America would be forced to question the official narrative. That event was just hours away. American military planners had built their entire strategy around a fundamental misunderstanding of their enemy. They saw the Viet Cong as a ragtag collection of peasant guerrillas hiding in the jungle. What they faced was actually one of the most sophisticated insurgent organizations in military history. The Viet Cong wasn't just an army. It was a shadow government that had been operating in South Vietnam for over a decade. In villages across the countryside, communist cadres collected taxes, settled disputes, and recruited fighters. They ran schools that taught revolutionary ideology alongside basic literacy. They operated hospitals, postal systems, and even marriage bureaus. This parallel state existed right under the noses of American advisors and South Vietnamese officials. While government forces controlled the cities during daylight hours, the Viet Cong governed the villages after dark. They had created a complete alternative to the Saigon regime, one that many rural Vietnamese found more responsive to their needs. Ho Chi Minh understood something that American strategists missed entirely. This wasn't a conventional war between two armies fighting for territory. It was a political struggle for the loyalty of the Vietnamese people. Military victories meant nothing if you couldn't convince the population that your cause was just. The organizational structure of the Viet Cong reflected this political focus. Small cells of 3 to 5 fighters operated independently, making it almost impossible to destroy the entire network. When one cell was captured, the others continued functioning. When a leader was killed, another immediately took his place. Intelligence networks penetrated every level of the South Vietnamese government. Viet Cong agents worked as clerks in American offices, servants in generals' homes, and translators for military units. They knew about operations before the American soldiers who would carry them out. This wasn't just espionage, it was total infiltration of the enemy's decision-making process. General von Nguyen Giap had learned his lessons from the French War. The same man who had orchestrated the victory at Dien Bien Phu understood that Americans had one critical weakness. They couldn't accept unlimited casualties for unlimited time. French colonial forces had been defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior patience. The Tet Offensive represented a complete shift in communist strategy. For years, they had avoided large-scale urban combat, preferring to bleed American forces through ambushes and booby traps in the countryside. But Giap recognized that rural guerrilla warfare, no matter how successful, couldn't break American will to fight. The American public needed to see the war's reality with their own eyes. As long as the fighting remained hidden in remote jungles, Pentagon spokesmen could explain away any setbacks. But if the enemy could bring the war to South Vietnam's major cities, if they could attack symbols of American power on live television, then no amount of official spin could maintain the illusion of progress. Months of careful preparation went into the Tet planning. Arms and ammunition were smuggled into urban areas and hidden in safe houses. Maps of government buildings were drawn and memorized. Escape routes were planned and rehearsed. Local sympathizers provided intelligence on security procedures and guard rotations. The coordination required for simultaneous attacks across the entire country demonstrated organizational capabilities that American intelligence had never credited to the enemy. This wasn't the work of scattered guerrilla bands. It was a centrally planned military operation involving tens of thousands of fighters operating with precision timing. What made the Viet Cong so dangerous wasn't their weapons or their numbers. It was their understanding of the war's true nature. While Americans focused on killing enemy soldiers and controlling territory, the communists focused on destroying American credibility and breaking public support for the war. They had studied American psychology as carefully as American tactics. They knew that democratic societies couldn't sustain wars that their citizens didn't understand or support. They knew that television images carried more weight than Pentagon statistics. They knew that a single dramatic attack could accomplish more than 100 jungle ambushes. The enemy that American generals dismissed as primitive and defeated was about to demonstrate a sophisticated grasp of modern warfare's psychological dimension. They understood that in the television age, perception was more important than reality. Military victories meant nothing if they looked like defeats on the evening news. American commanders had prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. They had overwhelming advantages in firepower, mobility, and technology. But they were about to discover that none of those advantages mattered when the enemy refused to fight on their terms. The first explosions shattered the pre-dawn silence at exactly 3:15 a.m. Across South Vietnam, from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ, 70,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters launched the most coordinated attack in the war's history. In Saigon, 19 sappers armed with explosives and AK-47s blasted through the outer wall of the American embassy. The compound that symbolized American power in Southeast Asia became a battlefield. Military police trapped inside the main building radioed frantically for reinforcements as gunfire echoed through the courtyard. The embassy attack lasted 6 brutal hours. Bodies of both American defenders and Viet Cong attackers littered the manicured grounds where diplomats had hosted cocktail parties just days before. When the shooting finally stopped, the most secure American installation in Vietnam had been penetrated and held by an enemy that was supposed to be defeated. But Saigon was just one target among more than 100 cities and towns under simultaneous assault. At Tan Son Nhut Airport, the busiest military airfield in the world, mortar rounds destroyed aircraft and set fuel depots ablaze. Viet Cong commandos fought their way onto the runway, where American transport planes had been landing supplies just hours earlier. The presidential palace, seat of the South Vietnamese government, came under direct attack. Communist fighters armed with rocket-propelled grenades blasted holes in the building's walls while government troops fired back from upper-floor windows. The battle raged through the morning as smoke rose from the heart of America's Allied capital. American commanders couldn't believe the initial reports flooding their communication centers. "This can't be happening," one general reportedly said as he stared at maps showing enemy attacks across the entire country. Intelligence had detected no signs of such a massive, coordinated operation. In the ancient imperial capital of Hue, 10,000 North Vietnamese troops seized 2/3 of the city in the war's largest urban battle. Government buildings fell one after another as communist forces raised their flag over the citadel, the 1,000-year-old fortress that had housed Vietnamese emperors. The speed of the attacks caught everyone off guard. South Vietnamese army units, many with soldiers on leave for the Tet holiday, scrambled to respond to emergencies in dozens of locations simultaneously. American advisors found themselves cut off from their headquarters, fighting alongside confused ARVN troops who had been expecting a peaceful New Year celebration. At fire bases throughout the countryside, American artillery crews turned their guns toward the cities they were supposed to be protecting. The war had literally come home to South Vietnam's urban centers, places that had been considered safe rear areas throughout 3 years of American escalation. Television crews, many based in Saigon hotels, found themselves in the middle of combat zones. Cameras captured images that would shock American viewers, enemy soldiers fighting in the streets of cities where American diplomats lived and worked. The war that had been hidden in remote jungles was now happening in front of international media. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. If the enemy could attack anywhere, at any time, then nowhere was safe. If they could penetrate the American embassy itself, then no American installation was secure. If they could coordinate attacks across an entire country, then they were far from the scattered, defeated force described in Pentagon briefings. Radio communications crackled with desperate requests for reinforcements, medical evacuation, and ammunition resupply. Units that had been preparing for routine patrols found themselves fighting for their lives in urban combat they had never trained for. The initiative had passed completely to an enemy that wasn't supposed to exist in such numbers or with such capabilities. By sunrise, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. The Tet Offensive had shattered every assumption about enemy capabilities and American security. The war that officials had promised was nearly won had exploded into every major population center in South Vietnam. The night that changed everything was just beginning. The real battle wasn't being fought in the streets of Saigon or Hue. It was being fought in the living rooms of America, where television screens would soon show images that contradicted 3 years of optimistic government reports. The ancient imperial city of Hue had survived 1,000 years of wars, invasions, and dynastic changes. By February 1st, 1968, it was burning. 10,000 North Vietnamese troops had seized control of 2/3 of Vietnam's cultural heart in the most audacious urban assault of the entire war. The Citadel, the massive fortress that had housed Vietnamese emperors since 1802, flew the communist flag for the first time in its history. American Marines found themselves fighting a completely different kind of war. Instead of jungle patrols and helicopter insertions, they were crawling through narrow alleyways and blasting through ancient walls. Every pagoda became a potential sniper's nest. Every ornate palace courtyard turned into a killing field. The Battle of Hue would last 26 days and become some of the most brutal urban combat American forces had ever experienced. House-to-house fighting through neighborhoods where families had lived for generations, room-to-room clearing operations in buildings that were older than the United States itself. North Vietnamese commanders had chosen Hue for maximum psychological impact. This wasn't just another provincial capital. It was the spiritual center of Vietnamese culture. The perfume river that flowed through the city had inspired poets for centuries. The Imperial Palace complex contained treasures that connected modern Vietnam to its imperial past. Now, American artillery was destroying those treasures in order to save the city from communist occupation. Ancient temples that had survived Mongol invasions and French colonialism were reduced to rubble by American firepower. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. America was destroying Vietnamese culture in order to preserve Vietnamese freedom. The civilian population found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Thousands of families huddled in their homes as the battle raged outside their doors. Those who tried to flee often found themselves caught in crossfires between opposing forces. The ancient city's narrow streets, perfect for defense, became death traps for anyone caught in the open. Communist forces had prepared for months, stockpiling weapons and ammunition in the city's maze of underground tunnels and hidden chambers. They knew every alley, every rooftop, every possible firing position. American Marines, trained for jungle warfare, struggled to adapt to urban combat in a city layout that dated back to medieval times. The fighting was personal and vicious in ways that jungle combat never was. Marines kicked down doors to find enemy soldiers hiding in family bedrooms. Communist fighters used civilian buildings as firing positions, forcing Americans to choose between protecting innocents and completing their mission. Every room could contain either terrified civilians or armed enemies. Television cameras captured the destruction in unprecedented detail. Network correspondents, many trapped in the city when the fighting began, broadcast live reports from combat zones. American viewers watched their Marines fighting with rifles and grenades through streets lined with ancient architecture. The contrast between modern warfare and historical setting created surreal images that no amount of Pentagon briefing could explain away. The battle exposed fundamental problems with American strategy in Vietnam. All the technology and firepower in the world couldn't quickly dislodge determined defenders from urban terrain. B-52 bombers and artillery barrages that worked in jungle warfare were useless when the enemy was hiding among civilian populations in historically significant buildings. South Vietnamese army units, supposedly responsible for defending their own cities, performed poorly under pressure. Many ARVN soldiers simply disappeared when the fighting began. Others fought bravely but lacked the training and equipment for sustained urban combat. American Marines found themselves doing most of the actual fighting while their supposed allies watched from safe positions. When the battle finally ended on March the 2nd, Hue was liberated but destroyed. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The Imperial Palace, damaged by communist occupation and American bombardment, would take decades to restore. Thousands of civilians were dead, wounded, or homeless. Mass graves discovered after the communist withdrawal revealed another horror: the systematic execution of South Vietnamese government officials, military officers, teachers, and anyone else considered an enemy of the revolution. Over 3,000 civilians had been murdered during the communist occupation, their bodies dumped in hastily dug pits around the city. The Battle of Hue proved that the enemy could not only attack major cities, but hold them for extended periods. They had demonstrated sophisticated planning, excellent intelligence, and the ability to fight conventional battles when it served their purposes. The ragtag guerrillas of Pentagon briefings had revealed themselves as a formidable military force capable of complex operations. Most importantly, Hue showed American television audiences that their military, despite overwhelming technological advantages, could be fought to a standstill by determined enemies using urban terrain to their advantage. The ancient capital's destruction became a symbol of everything that was going wrong with American strategy in Vietnam. While the world watched Hue burn and Saigon bleed, another drama was unfolding in the remote mountains near the DMZ. 6,000 American Marines were surrounded by 20,000 North Vietnamese troops at a fire base that most Americans had never heard of, Khe Sanh. The siege had begun on January 21st, 10 days before the Tet Offensive exploded across South Vietnam's cities. General Westmoreland became obsessed with defending this isolated outpost, convinced it was the enemy's main objective. He poured resources into Khe Sanh while communist forces prepared their urban assaults elsewhere. The Marines lived underground, burrowing into bunkers and trenches as enemy rockets and mortars rained down daily. The red clay hills around the fire base became a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. Resupply missions required desperate flights through walls of anti-aircraft fire. Many planes never made it through. Westmoreland saw Khe Sanh as his chance for a decisive victory. He compared it to the Alamo, but with a different ending. The enemy had finally massed for conventional battle where American firepower could destroy them. This was the kind of war Americans knew how to fight and win. The comparison that haunted everyone was Dien Bien Phu. 14 years earlier, Vietnamese forces had surrounded and destroyed a French garrison in a remote valley, ending French colonial rule in Indochina. The parallels were unmistakable. Isolated fire base, surrounded by hills, enemy artillery raining down from concealed positions. President Johnson became so worried about another Dien Bien Phu that he ordered the Joint Chiefs of Staff to sign a written guarantee that Khe Sanh could be held. He had a scale model of the fire base built in the White House Situation Room and studied it obsessively. The remote fire base had become a symbol of American credibility. Operation Niagara unleashed the most concentrated bombing campaign in military history. B-52 Stratofortresses dropped over 100,000 tons of explosives on the hills surrounding Khe Sanh. The bombing runs continued around the clock, shaking the earth for miles in every direction. It was more firepower than had been used in many entire World War II campaigns. But the Marines trapped in the bunkers couldn't see the results. Enemy fire continued with deadly accuracy. Snipers picked off anyone who moved above ground during daylight. Rocket attacks came at random intervals, keeping everyone in a constant state of terror. Sleep became impossible as the ground shook from incoming artillery. The psychological pressure was enormous on both sides. Marines wrote letters home that they never expected anyone to read. Many had nightmares about being overrun in human wave attacks. Radio communications crackled with requests for emergency medical evacuation and ammunition resupply that couldn't always be fulfilled. The siege became a test of wills between American technology and Vietnamese patience. Every day that Khe Sanh held out was a victory for American resolve. Every day that the enemy maintained their attack was proof of their determination. The entire war seemed to be concentrated in this remote valley that few Americans could locate on a map. Media attention focused on Khe Sanh, while the real Tet battles raged in South Vietnam cities. Television crews couldn't reach the isolated firebase, so the siege became a story told through Pentagon briefings and long-range camera shots. The drama was obvious, but the details remained hidden from public view. What the Marines didn't know was that Khe Sanh was a diversion. While Westmoreland concentrated his attention and resources on defending the remote firebase, enemy forces were infiltrating every major city in South Vietnam. The siege was brilliantly conceived psychological warfare. It fixed American attention on the wrong target while the real attack developed elsewhere. The irony was perfect. American commanders, obsessed with avoiding another Dien Bien Phu, had created their own version of the French disaster. They had isolated a large force in an indefensible position and then committed everything to holding it. The enemy had learned from French mistakes and turned American fears against them. On April 1st, after 77 days of siege, the Marines abandoned Khe Sanh. The firebase that had consumed so much attention and resources was quietly evacuated and destroyed. The enemy had achieved their real objective. The Tet offensive had succeeded while America's military leadership was distracted by a meaningless battle in the mountains. For the first time in American history, a war was being fought in the nation's living rooms. Television cameras captured images that no Pentagon briefing could explain away or sanitize. The Tet offensive wasn't just a military battle. It was a media revolution that changed how Americans understood warfare forever. Network news crews found themselves in the middle of combat zones they had never expected to cover. Correspondents who had been filing routine reports from secure hotels suddenly faced gunfire in the streets outside their windows. The war that had been safely contained in remote jungles was now happening, where cameras could capture every terrifying moment. The images were devastating to American confidence. Viewers saw enemy soldiers fighting inside the American embassy compound, the most secure building in South Vietnam. They watched communist fighters battle government troops in downtown Saigon while American helicopters circled overhead. These weren't distant jungle skirmishes. This was urban warfare in cities where American diplomats lived and worked. CBS correspondent Morley Safer had already shocked viewers in 1965 with his report from Cam Ne, showing American Marines using Zippo lighters to burn down a Vietnamese village. That single report generated more viewer response than any story in CBS history. Now, 3 years later, television was bringing even more disturbing images into American homes on a nightly basis. The most powerful photograph of the entire war came during the Tet fighting. Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams captured the exact moment when South Vietnamese General Nguyen Ngoc Loan executed a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street. The image of the pistol firing into the man's head appeared on front pages across America and won the Pulitzer Prize. That photograph crystallized everything that was wrong with American involvement in Vietnam. The execution happened in broad daylight on a city street with no trial or legal process. America's ally was committing murder while American advisors stood nearby. The image suggested that the South Vietnamese government Americans were dying to defend was no better than the enemy they were fighting. Television coverage during Tet revealed the gap between Pentagon statistics and battlefield reality. Military briefers could claim enemy casualties and territory controlled, but cameras showed communist forces fighting in the heart of South Vietnam's capital city. Body counts meant nothing when the supposedly defeated enemy was attacking government buildings on live television. Network News expanded their Vietnam coverage dramatically during the Tet fighting. Correspondents who had been filing 2-minute segments suddenly found themselves broadcasting live from combat zones. The war became the lead story every night, pushing aside domestic politics and other international news. American families planned their evening schedules around war updates. The danger to journalists became part of the story itself. Correspondents ducked sniper fire while delivering reports. Camera crews filmed battles from rooftops and hotel balconies while bullets shattered windows around them. The media was no longer just observing the war. They were participants in it, sharing the same risks as the soldiers they covered. Television's impact went far beyond simple news reporting. The medium created emotional connections between viewers and distant events in ways that newspapers never could. When Americans saw Marines fighting house to house in Hue, they felt the terror and confusion of urban combat. When they watched embassy guards trapped under enemy fire, they experienced the vulnerability of American power. The visual evidence contradicted everything Americans had been told about the war's progress. Official briefings claimed the enemy was weak and demoralized, but television showed them attacking everywhere simultaneously with sophisticated coordination. Pentagon spokesmen insisted victory was near, but cameras revealed American forces struggling to defend their own installations. Most importantly, television coverage during Tet proved that the medium could shape public opinion more powerfully than any government propaganda campaign. The images of urban warfare, civilian casualties, and American vulnerability created a narrative that no amount of official spin could overcome. Television had become the battlefield where the real war would be won or lost. Military officials scrambled to control the narrative disaster unfolding on television screens across America. At the daily briefings in Saigon, Pentagon spokesmen insisted that Tet was actually a major American victory. The body counts proved it. Over 45,000 enemy fighters killed, compared to just 6,000 Allied casualties. The enemy has suffered a devastating defeat, General Westmoreland declared to assembled reporters. They have failed to achieve any of their military objectives. This desperate attack only proves how weak they have become. But those confident words rang hollow when Americans could see enemy soldiers fighting inside the American embassy compound on their television screens. The statistics didn't matter when communist forces were raising their flag over the ancient citadel in Hue. Military victories meant nothing when the supposedly defeated enemy was attacking over 100 cities simultaneously. The disconnect between official reports and televised reality created a credibility crisis unlike anything in American history. For 3 years, Pentagon briefings had painted a picture of steady progress and inevitable victory. Enemy body counts climbed month after month. Maps showed expanding areas under government control. Charts tracked weapons captured and villages pacified. All of those optimistic assessments were now revealed as either incompetent analysis or deliberate deception. If American intelligence was so superior, how had 70,000 enemy fighters coordinated attacks across an entire country without detection? If the Viet Cong was a broken force, how had they penetrated America's most secure installations? The questions multiplied faster than the Pentagon could provide answers. If the enemy was running out of recruits, where did all these fighters come from? If American firepower was so overwhelming, why were Marines still fighting house to house in Hue after 3 weeks? If South Vietnamese forces were improving, why had they performed so poorly when their own cities came under attack? Public opinion polls showed the immediate impact of this credibility collapse. Before Tet, 56% of Americans believed the war was going well. After just 2 weeks of urban combat footage, that number dropped to 32%. The shift wasn't gradual. It was a cliff dive in public confidence that reflected the shock of seeing official lies exposed on live television. The Pentagon Papers, published years later, would reveal the full extent of government deception. Internal documents showed that military leaders had known for years that the war was unwinnable. They had deliberately inflated enemy casualty figures while downplaying American losses. They had painted rosy scenarios for public consumption while privately expressing deep pessimism about long-term prospects. But Americans didn't need classified documents to understand they had been lied to. The evidence was right there on their television screens every night. The enemy that was supposed to be defeated was fighting in downtown Saigon. The war that was nearly won was exploding into every major city in South Vietnam. Trust in government plummeted to historic lows. If officials would lie about something as serious as war progress, what else were they lying about? The credibility gap that had been growing slowly for years suddenly became a chasm that would define American politics for decades. Johnson administration officials tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. They emphasized tactical victories and enemy casualties. They pointed to the failure of communist forces to hold any major cities permanently. They argued that Tet proved enemy desperation, not strength. None of it worked. The American public had seen too much and heard too many contradictions to believe official explanations anymore. The gap between Pentagon briefings and television reality was too wide to bridge with statistics and spin. The most devastating realization was that if the government would lie about military progress, they might be lying about the war's fundamental purpose. Americans began questioning not just whether the war was winnable, but whether it was worth winning. The credibility gap had exploded into something much more dangerous, a crisis of faith in American leadership itself. The enemy's psychological victory was complete. They had turned America's own media against its own government. The Tet Offensive had achieved something that no military defeat could accomplish. It had broken the bond of trust between the American people and their elected leaders. February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite sat in his CBS studio preparing to do something he had never done in his entire career. For the first time, Uncle Walter was about to abandon journalistic objectivity and tell the American people what he really thought about the Vietnam War. 3 weeks had passed since the Tet Offensive began. 3 weeks of watching American officials insist that military victories proved the war was going well, while television cameras showed the opposite reality. Cronkite had just returned from his own fact-finding trip to Vietnam, and what he saw there shook him to his core. The most trusted man in America was about to break trust with his own profession's standards, but he had concluded that objectivity was no longer possible when the government was systematically lying to the public about matters of life and death. Tonight, back in more familiar surroundings in New York, Cronkite began, his voice carrying unusual gravity. We'd like to sum up our findings in Vietnam, an analysis that must be speculative, personal, subjective. Those words, speculative, personal, subjective, were revolutionary coming from Walter Cronkite. For years, he had presented the news without editorial comment, letting viewers draw their own conclusions from the facts. But the facts themselves had become so distorted by official deception that neutrality was no longer honest journalism. We have been too often disappointed by the optimism of the American leaders, both in Vietnam and Washington, to have faith any longer in the silver linings they find in the darkest clouds. Cronkite continued, his tone growing more pointed with each word. 20 million Americans were watching. In living rooms across the country, families sat transfixed as their most trusted news source dismantled 3 years of government war propaganda. This wasn't some radical activist or political opponent criticizing the war. This was Walter Cronkite, the man who had supported American involvement from the beginning. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. That word, stalemate, cut through every Pentagon briefing and White House assurance like a knife. If America wasn't winning and couldn't win, then what were American soldiers dying for? If the most powerful military in history was stalemated by peasant guerrillas, then what did that say about American strategy? On the political front, past performance gives no confidence that the South Vietnamese government can cope with its problems, now compounded by the attack on the cities. It may not fall, it may hold on, but it probably won't show the dynamic qualities demanded of this young nation's leadership. Cronkite was systematically destroying every justification for continued American involvement. The South Vietnamese government was incompetent. Military progress was an illusion. The enemy was far from defeated. The war was unwinnable under current strategy. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. The suggestion that America should negotiate from a position of non-victory was heretical in 1968. Presidents didn't negotiate stalemates. They won wars or lost them. But Cronkite was proposing something unprecedented, an honest acknowledgement of American limitations. President Johnson reportedly watched the broadcast from the White House and turned to his aides with a look of defeat. "If I've lost Cronkite," he said, "I've lost Middle America." The president understood immediately that his war policy couldn't survive opposition from the most trusted voice in the country. The reaction was swift and dramatic. Telephone switchboards at CBS were flooded with calls, some angry, some grateful, all passionate. Letters poured in from viewers who had been waiting for someone with Cronkite's credibility to speak the truth they felt in their hearts. Other television journalists, emboldened by Cronkite's example, began questioning official war claims more aggressively. The era of stenographic journalism, simply reporting what government officials said without independent analysis, was ending. The press was becoming adversarial, skeptical, investigative. The broadcast marked a turning point, not just in war coverage, but in the relationship between media and government. Never again would American journalists accept official statements at face value during wartime. The credibility gap had permanently changed how the press viewed its role in a democracy. Cronkite's editorial didn't end the Vietnam War, but it ended the illusion that the war was winnable under existing strategy. When America's most trusted journalist declared the conflict a stalemate, he gave voice to doubts that millions of Americans had been feeling but couldn't articulate. The psychological victory that the Tet Offensive had won on the battlefield was now complete in America's living rooms. Cronkite's bombshell broadcast didn't create the anti-war movement. It legitimized it. Across America, college campuses that had been simmering with discontent suddenly erupted into full rebellion. Students who had been questioning the war in private now felt vindicated by the most trusted voice in journalism. At Columbia University, students occupied administration buildings and refused to leave until the university cut ties with military research projects. At Berkeley, protesters surrounded recruitment centers and prevented military officers from meeting with potential enlistees. The chant, "Hell no, we won't go," echoed across campuses from coast to coast. But the rebellion wasn't limited to radical students anymore. Tet had brought the anti-war movement into America's mainstream. Suburban mothers who had never protested anything in their lives began organizing against a war that was clearly not going as promised. Church groups that had supported American involvement now questioned the morality of bombing Vietnamese cities. Draft card burning became the defining symbol of resistance. Young men who faced the possibility of fighting in an unwinnable war made their choice in dramatic public ceremonies. They gathered on campus quads and city squares, holding their draft cards over flames while crowds cheered. Each burning card was a personal declaration that this war wasn't worth dying for. The generational divide that had been building throughout the 1960s exploded into open warfare within American families. Sons argued with fathers who had fought in World War II and couldn't understand why this war was different. Parents who had raised their children to respect authority watched those same children openly defying the government. My son came home from college and called me a war criminal, one father wrote to his local newspaper. He said I was supporting genocide in Vietnam. I fought the Nazis, and now my own boy thinks I'm evil. This war is tearing our family apart. The women's peace movement gained unprecedented power after Tet. Organizations like Women's Strike for Peace mobilized thousands of mothers who had personal stakes in ending the conflict. These weren't radical feminists or political activists. They were ordinary American women whose sons faced the draft. Their moral authority was unassailable. Veterans returning from Vietnam found themselves caught between two worlds. The government that had sent them to fight was still claiming victory, but they had seen the reality of Tet with their own eyes. Many joined Vietnam veterans against the war, lending their credibility to the anti-war movement in ways that student protesters never could. The sight of uniformed veterans throwing their medals over the White House fence became one of the most powerful images of the anti-war movement. These men had earned the right to criticize the war through their service. When they spoke against continued involvement, even conservative Americans listened. Civil rights leaders connected the war to domestic racism in ways that broadened the anti-war coalition. We are taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia. Martin Luther King Jr. declared, linking the struggle for racial justice to opposition to the war. The cultural rebellion went beyond politics into music, fashion, and lifestyle choices. Rock concerts became anti-war rallies. Folk singers wrote protest songs that climbed the charts. The counterculture that had been emerging throughout the decade suddenly had a unifying cause that connected personal freedom to political resistance. Even mainstream politicians began breaking ranks with the administration. Senator Eugene McCarthy's primary challenge to Johnson gained momentum as Tet proved the war was unwinnable. Bobby Kennedy entered the race, bringing the moral authority of the Kennedy name to the anti-war cause. The Chicago Democratic Convention in August 1968 would become the climax of this home front rebellion. Television cameras captured police beating anti-war demonstrators in the streets, while inside the convention hall, delegates fought over the party's war platform. The violence shocked Americans who still believed in peaceful political processes. But the damage to Johnson's presidency was already complete. The anti-war movement that Tet had legitimized would force him from office and change American politics forever. The home front rebellion had achieved what the Viet Cong could never accomplish through military action alone. It had broken the American consensus for war. By March 1968, Lyndon Johnson was a broken man. The president who had won the largest electoral landslide in American history just 4 years earlier now found himself trapped in the White House, unable to appear in public without facing hostile crowds chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" The Tet offensive had destroyed more than military credibility. It had shattered Johnson's political future. Opinion polls showed his approval rating collapsing to just 35%, the lowest of any president since Harry Truman. Even worse, 78% of Americans now believe the country was on the wrong track, a devastating indictment of his leadership. The Democratic Party was tearing itself apart over Vietnam. Senator Eugene McCarthy's anti-war primary campaign, dismissed as a hopeless gesture just months earlier, was gaining dangerous momentum. College students who had been burning draft cards were now organizing voter registration drives. The same energy that fueled campus protests was flowing into electoral politics. Johnson's own advisors were abandoning him. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, the architect of American escalation, had resigned in despair. Secretary of State Dean Rusk faced hostile questioning every time he appeared before Congress. The wise men who had guided American foreign policy since World War II were telling Johnson privately that the war couldn't be won. The New Hampshire primary on March 12th delivered the crushing blow. McCarthy won 42% of the vote against a sitting president, a result that shocked the political establishment. Johnson had technically won the primary, but everyone understood that losing 42% to an unknown senator was actually a devastating defeat. 4 days later, Bobby Kennedy entered the presidential race. The brother of the martyred president brought moral authority and political skill that McCarthy couldn't match. Kennedy's announcement speech was a direct attack on Johnson's war policy. "I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who make them." The prospect of facing both McCarthy and Kennedy in a brutal primary fight terrified Johnson's remaining supporters. Internal polling showed the president losing key states that Democrats had to win in November. The anti-war movement that Tet had energized was becoming an electoral tsunami that would sweep Johnson from office. On March 25th, Johnson gathered his closest advisors for a final strategy session. The military was requesting another 200,000 troops for Vietnam, bringing total American commitment to over 700,000 soldiers. The cost would exceed $30 billion per year, destroying Johnson's Great Society domestic programs. The political cost would be even higher. "I can't run again," Johnson told his staff, his voice barely above a whisper. "The country won't unite behind me. The war has made that impossible." The speech Johnson delivered to the nation on March 31st shocked even his closest associates. After announcing a halt to bombing in North Vietnam and proposing peace talks, the president looked directly into the camera and spoke the words that ended his political career. "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The announcement stunned the political world. A sitting president was withdrawing from the race rather than face certain defeat over his war policy. Johnson had become the most powerful casualty of the Tet Offensive, brought down not by enemy bullets, but by American public opinion. The Great Society president who had dreamed of eliminating poverty and racism had been destroyed by a war he never wanted to fight. Johnson's tragedy was that he understood the futility of Vietnam, but felt trapped by the political consequences of withdrawal. Tet had made those consequences irrelevant by making continuation politically impossible. The anti-war movement had achieved its ultimate goal. They had driven a president from office through the democratic process. The home front rebellion that began on college campuses had reached the highest levels of American government. The political shockwave of the Tet Offensive was complete. General William Westmoreland had built his entire reputation on the promise of victory in Vietnam. The four-star commander who had overseen the massive American buildup from 1964 to 1968 now found himself explaining how an enemy he had declared nearly defeated could launch coordinated attacks across an entire country. The general who had confidently told Congress just months earlier that he could see light at the end of the tunnel was now requesting 200,000 additional troops. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. If the war was going so well, why did he need more soldiers than ever before? Westmoreland's credibility collapsed overnight. The optimistic assessments he had been feeding to Washington for years were exposed as either incompetent analysis or deliberate deception. Intelligence reports that claimed the enemy was running out of fighters couldn't explain where 70,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops had come from for the Tet attacks. The general tried desperately to spin the offensive as an American victory. "The enemy has suffered a devastating military defeat," he insisted at press conferences. "They failed to achieve any of their objectives and lost over 45,000 fighters in the process." But those statistics rang hollow when television cameras showed enemy soldiers fighting inside the American embassy compound. Military victories meant nothing when the supposedly defeated enemy was attacking over 100 cities simultaneously. The American public could see the contradiction with their own eyes. Congressional hearings became brutal interrogations of military leadership. Senators who had supported escalation for years now demanded explanations for intelligence failures. How had American commanders been so completely surprised by an attack involving tens of thousands of enemy fighters? How had infiltration on such a massive scale gone undetected? General, you told us the enemy was weak and demoralized, Senator William Fulbright said during one particularly heated exchange. How do you reconcile that assessment with what we've seen during Tet? Westmoreland's responses became increasingly defensive and contradictory. He blamed the media for distorting American victories. He insisted that enemy casualties proved the offensive was a failure. He argued that urban attacks showed enemy desperation, not strength. None of his explanations satisfied critics who had watched the embassy siege on live television. The gap between military briefings and battlefield reality was too wide to bridge with statistics and spin. Other senior officers found their careers destroyed by association with failed strategy. Generals who had enthusiastically supported escalation now faced congressional investigations and media scrutiny. The military establishment that had promised quick victory was being held accountable for years of overconfident predictions. The request for 200,000 additional troops became the final straw for many officials who had previously supported the war effort. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford, who had replaced Robert McNamara just weeks before Tet, conducted his own review of military strategy and concluded the war was unwinnable. "We have no military plan to end this war," Clifford told President Johnson in a classified briefing that would later be revealed in the Pentagon Papers. "We are fighting a war with no clear objectives against an enemy that can replace its losses indefinitely." The doctrine of overwhelming firepower that had guided American military thinking since World War II was proving useless against an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles. All the technology and weaponry in the world couldn't defeat guerrilla fighters who had the support of the local population. Young officers who had served in Vietnam began speaking out against their superiors' optimistic assessments. These combat veterans had seen the war's reality firsthand and knew that official reports bore no resemblance to conditions in the field. Their testimonies to Congress provided devastating counterpoints to Pentagon briefings. The military's credibility would never fully recover from Tet. Future conflicts would be planned with much more skepticism about official assessments and progress reports. The era of unquestioning faith in military leadership was ending, replaced by demands for transparency and accountability. Westmoreland was quietly reassigned to a desk job in Washington, his career effectively over. The general who had promised victory in Vietnam became a symbol of American overconfidence and strategic failure. His downfall marked the end of an era when military commanders could wage war without facing serious public scrutiny. The numbers told one story, but the reality told another. On paper, the Tet Offensive was a catastrophic military defeat for Communist forces. Over 45,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters were killed or wounded. They failed to hold any major cities permanently. Popular uprisings against the South Vietnamese government never materialized. By every traditional measure of military success, the Americans had won decisively. But General Giap and the communist leadership had never been fighting a traditional war. They understood something that American commanders missed completely. In a democracy fighting a distant war, perception matters more than battlefield statistics. Military victories mean nothing if they look like defeats on television. The Tet Offensive achieved exactly what it was designed to accomplish. It shattered the illusion of American progress and inevitable victory. It exposed the weakness of the South Vietnamese government. Most importantly, it broke American public support for continued involvement in a war that clearly had no end in sight. Communist forces had sacrificed tens of thousands of fighters to win a psychological victory that no military defeat could have achieved. They traded tactical losses for strategic gains, understanding that American democracy contained the seeds of its own military limitations. The urban warfare that shocked American television audiences served multiple propaganda purposes. It proved that nowhere in South Vietnam was truly safe from communist attack. It demonstrated that the enemy could strike at will, whenever and wherever they chose. It showed that 3 years of American escalation had failed to secure even the most important government installations. International opinion shifted dramatically after Tet. Allied governments that had quietly supported American involvement began expressing doubts about the war's conduct and objectives. The image of the world's most powerful military struggling to defend its own embassy from guerrilla fighters damaged American credibility globally. The communist strategy of protracted warfare was working exactly as planned. Ho Chi Minh had studied American history and understood that democratic societies couldn't sustain wars that their citizens didn't support. The American Revolution had succeeded against the British Empire using similar tactics, making the cost of occupation higher than the value of victory. Every day that the war continued now worked in favor of the communists. American casualties mounted without clear progress toward any achievable objective. Military expenses consumed resources needed for domestic programs. Social divisions widened as the anti-war movement gained momentum from Tet's revelations. The communist leadership had correctly calculated that Americans would eventually tire of a war they couldn't understand or win. Unlike the Vietnamese who were fighting for their homeland, Americans were fighting for abstract concepts like containing communism and maintaining credibility. Abstract causes couldn't sustain public support through years of inconclusive warfare. The infiltration tactics used during Tet proved that communist intelligence networks had penetrated every level of South Vietnamese society. Government officials, military officers, and civilian employees had provided information that made the coordinated attacks possible. This wasn't just military espionage. It was evidence of widespread political opposition to the Saigon regime. The failure of South Vietnamese forces during the urban battles revealed the fundamental weakness of America's entire strategy. After years of training and billions of dollars in equipment, ARVN units still couldn't defend their own cities without massive American support. If South Vietnamese troops wouldn't fight for their own government, why should Americans die for it? Most devastatingly, Tet exposed the hollow nature of American claims about winning hearts and minds. The enemy's ability to operate freely in urban areas proved that the population wasn't supporting the government. Americans were dying to defend. Pacification programs that looked successful on paper had clearly failed to create genuine loyalty. The communist victory wasn't measured in territory captured or battles won. It was measured in American public opinion polls and political developments. When Walter Cronkite declared the war a stalemate, when college campuses erupted in protest, when President Johnson withdrew from the election, the Tet Offensive achieved its strategic objectives. The psychological warfare campaign that began with coordinated military attacks had succeeded beyond the communists' wildest expectations. They had turned America's own democratic institutions and free press against the war effort. They had proven that military superiority meant nothing without political will to continue fighting. The Viet Cong's strategic victory was complete. They had lost the battles but won the war, understanding that in the television age, images carried more weight than body counts, and public opinion mattered more than military statistics. The Tet Offensive didn't just reveal communist strength, it exposed the fundamental weakness of America's South Vietnamese allies. When enemy forces attacked their own cities, the government that Americans were dying to defend crumbled like a house of cards. ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, had been trained and equipped by American advisors for years. They had modern weapons, air support, and overwhelming firepower advantages. On paper, they looked like a formidable military force. In reality, they collapsed at the first sign of serious fighting. In Saigon, entire ARVN units simply disappeared when the shooting started. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled to their families instead of defending government installations. Officers abandoned their posts without orders, leaving American advisors to coordinate the defense of South Vietnamese territory. The contrast was stark and undeniable. While American Marines fought house to house in Hue for 26 days, ARVN forces watched from safe positions or retreated entirely. The ancient capital that represented Vietnamese cultural identity was being defended by foreign soldiers, while the Vietnamese army fled. President Nguyen Van Thieu's government proved equally incompetent under pressure. Instead of rallying the population against the communist attacks, government officials focused on protecting themselves and their families. Many fled the capital entirely, leaving American diplomats to maintain basic government functions. The corruption that had plagued the Saigon regime for years became impossible to hide during the crisis. Military supplies disappeared into black markets, while soldiers lacked ammunition. Government positions were bought and sold, while competent officers were passed over for promotion. The system Americans were supporting was rotten from top to bottom. Even worse, the population's reaction to the Tet attacks revealed where their true loyalties lay. Instead of supporting government forces against the communist assault, many civilians provided intelligence and assistance to the attackers. The hearts and minds that Americans thought they were winning had never been won at all. The execution photograph that shocked the world, General Lone shooting a Viet Cong prisoner in the head on a Saigon street, symbolized everything wrong with America's ally. This was the kind of government Americans were dying to preserve, one that murdered prisoners without trial while photographers watched. South Vietnamese police proved as unreliable as the military. Many officers simply went home when the fighting began, leaving their posts unmanned. Those who remained often spent more time looting abandoned buildings than fighting enemy forces. The law and order that was supposed to justify American involvement existed only on paper. The government's propaganda efforts were laughably ineffective compared to communist messaging. While Viet Cong forces distributed leaflets explaining their cause, South Vietnamese officials could only offer empty promises about democracy and freedom. The ideological battle was being won by the side that actually believed in something. Intelligence failures reached criminal levels of incompetence. ARVN commanders had no idea where enemy forces were concentrated or when attacks might come. Their intelligence networks had been completely penetrated by communist agents. They were fighting blind against an enemy that knew their every move. The refugee crisis that followed Tet attacks exposed another government failure. Hundreds of thousands of civilians fled the fighting, but Saigon had no plans for housing, feeding, or protecting them. American forces found themselves providing humanitarian aid that the South Vietnamese government should have been handling. Most damaging of all was the revelation that many government officials had been secretly negotiating with communist forces throughout the war. The regime Americans were supporting wasn't just incompetent. It was actively hedging its bets in case the communists won. American advisors who had spent years training ARVN forces watched in horror as their students abandoned everything they had been taught. The South Vietnamese military that was supposed to eventually take over the fighting couldn't even defend its own capital without massive American assistance. The question that haunted every American watching the Tet battles was simple but devastating. If the South Vietnamese wouldn't fight for their own government, why should Americans die for it? The Tet offensive had exposed the puppet strings that held the Saigon regime together, and everyone could see how thin they really were. The Tet offensive didn't just change American public opinion about Vietnam, it revolutionized how wars would be covered forever. The cozy relationship between military officials and war correspondents, built on mutual trust and shared patriotic goals, died in the rubble of the American embassy compound. For decades, American war reporters had functioned essentially as stenographers for the Pentagon. They dutifully reported whatever military briefers told them, rarely questioning official statistics or challenging optimistic assessments. Journalists saw themselves as part of the war effort, helping maintain morale on the home front by emphasizing American victories and downplaying setbacks. That era of cooperative journalism ended abruptly when television cameras showed enemy soldiers fighting inside America's most secure installation in Saigon. Reporters who had been faithfully transcribing Pentagon briefings about enemy weakness suddenly found themselves ducking gunfire from supposedly defeated forces. The credibility gap that exploded during Tet forced journalists to choose between their traditional role as government allies and their professional obligation to report truth. Most chose truth, fundamentally altering the relationship between press and military that had existed since World War II. Television correspondents stopped simply reporting what officials told them and started investigating claims independently. When Pentagon spokesmen insisted Tet was an American victory, reporters asked pointed questions about how a defeated enemy could attack over 100 cities simultaneously. When military briefers claimed enemy casualties proved communist weakness, journalists wondered why those same casualties hadn't prevented coordinated urban warfare. The transformation was dramatic and immediate. Press conferences that had been friendly exchanges between military officials and cooperative reporters became adversarial confrontations. Journalists began treating government statements with skepticism rather than automatic acceptance. The era of gotcha journalism was born in the aftermath of Tet's revelations. Network news divisions expanded their Vietnam coverage dramatically, assigning their most experienced correspondents to investigate discrepancies between official claims and battlefield reality. CBS, NBC, and ABC competed to expose the next government lie or intelligence failure. War reporting became investigative journalism rather than patriotic cheerleading. The danger to journalists covering combat zones became part of the story itself. But it also gave reporters credibility that Pentagon briefers couldn't match. Correspondents who had personally experienced enemy attacks could speak with authority about military realities that desk-bound officials only knew from sanitized reports. Most importantly, television's visual power proved that images could overcome any amount of official spin. Pentagon statistics about enemy casualties meant nothing when viewers could see communist forces attacking government buildings on live television. Charts showing territorial control were irrelevant when cameras captured urban warfare in South Vietnam's capital city. The media revolution that began during Tet established new standards for war coverage that would influence every future conflict. Never again would American journalists accept military briefings at face value. The press had learned that governments lied during wartime, and their job was to expose those lies rather than repeat them. Future administrations would have to plan military operations with the assumption that skeptical reporters would investigate every claim and challenge every statistic. The days when presidents could wage war without serious media scrutiny were over, replaced by an adversarial relationship that treated official statements as starting points for investigation rather than final truths. The Pentagon began developing sophisticated media management strategies to control information flow and shape coverage. Military officials learned to provide just enough access to satisfy reporters while limiting their ability to uncover embarrassing facts. The cat-and-mouse game between government and press that defines modern war reporting began during the Tet Offensive. Most significantly, the media revolution that Tet triggered established television as the dominant force in shaping public opinion about foreign policy. Presidents who wanted public support for military action would have to win the battle for television coverage, understanding that images carried more weight than speeches or statistics. The transformation was irreversible. American journalism had discovered its power to influence policy by exposing government deception. The media revolution that began with Tet coverage would reshape not just war reporting, but the entire relationship between press and government in a democracy where information is power. The Tet Offensive had done something that years of campus protests couldn't accomplish. It proved the anti-war movement right. Students who had been dismissed as radical troublemakers were suddenly vindicated by Walter Cronkite and battlefield reality. The fringe movement that began in Berkeley coffee shops was about to become the dominant force in American politics. Moderate Americans who had never questioned government policy found themselves marching alongside long-haired college students they had previously scorned. The suburban mothers who organized bake sales for the PDA were now organizing letter-writing campaigns demanding immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. The credibility gap had turned Middle America into revolutionaries. Churches that had blessed American soldiers heading off to war now opened their doors to anti-war organizers. Methodist ministers who had preached about Christian duty to fight communism were delivering sermons about the immorality of bombing Vietnamese villages. The moral authority of organized religion was shifting decisively against the war. The draft resistance movement exploded from isolated acts of individual conscience into mass civil disobedience. Young men who faced the possibility of fighting in an obviously unwinnable war made their choice in increasingly dramatic fashion. Draft card burning ceremonies drew thousands of participants and even more supporters. But the most powerful new voice in the anti-war movement came from an unexpected source: the veterans themselves. Men who had earned the right to criticize the war through their service began speaking out in ways that no student protester could match. When uniformed soldiers threw their medals over the White House fence, even conservative Americans had to listen. Vietnam Veterans Against the War became the movement's most credible spokesperson. These weren't draft dodgers or campus radicals. They were combat veterans who had seen the war's reality firsthand. When they testified before Congress about atrocities and pointless battles, their words carried weight that no amount of government spin could overcome. We are here to ask, and we are here to ask vehemently, where are the leaders of our country? Navy Lieutenant John Kerry demanded during congressional testimony that would launch his political career. How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? The anti-war movement's growth after Tet wasn't just about numbers. It was about respectability. Professors who had quietly opposed the war began organizing teach-ins. Lawyers formed committees to defend draft resistors. Doctors volunteered to treat wounded protesters. The movement was gaining institutional support from America's professional classes. Women's peace organizations mobilized with unprecedented effectiveness. Groups like Women's Strike for Peace and Another Mother for Peace tapped into maternal instincts that transcended political ideology. When mothers demanded to know why their sons were dying for a government that couldn't defend its own embassy, politicians had no good answers. The cultural impact went far beyond politics into music, art, and popular entertainment. Folk singers like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan provided anthems for the movement. Rock concerts became anti-war rallies. Hollywood celebrities lent their names and money to anti-war causes, giving the movement glamour and media attention. Even labor unions, traditionally supportive of American military action, began questioning the war's conduct and objectives. Union leaders who had backed escalation for years now worried about the economic costs of prolonged fighting. When working-class families started opposing the war, politicians knew the political ground had shifted permanently. The movement's tactics evolved from symbolic protests to practical politics. Anti-war activists who had been content to march and chant now focused on voter registration and candidate recruitment. The energy that had fueled campus demonstrations was channeling into electoral campaigns that would reshape the Democratic Party. Eugene McCarthy's surprising primary performance in New Hampshire proved that anti-war sentiment could translate into political power. College students who had been burning draft cards were now canvassing door-to-door for candidates who promised to end the war. The movement had discovered that democracy offered more effective weapons than street protests. Bobby Kennedy's entry into the presidential race gave the anti-war movement a candidate with both moral authority and political skill. The martyred president's brother brought credibility that McCarthy couldn't match and resources that student organizers could only dream about. The movement finally had a champion who could win. The transformation was remarkable and swift. In less than 2 months, the anti-war movement had evolved from a fringe cause supported by radical students into a mainstream political force backed by veterans, mothers, clergy, and professionals. The Tet Offensive had legitimized opposition to the war in ways that years of protests never could. The psychological victory that communist forces had won on Vietnamese battlefields was now translating into political victory on the American home front. The anti-war movement that Tet had empowered would drive a president from office and end American involvement in Southeast Asia. The shockwaves of the Tet Offensive rippled far beyond America's borders, damaging relationships that had taken decades to build. Allied governments that had quietly supported American involvement in Vietnam suddenly found themselves questioning not just the war's conduct, but America's competence as a global leader. British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who had resisted American pressure to send troops to Vietnam, now felt vindicated in his caution. The events in Saigon raised serious questions about American intelligence capabilities, Wilson told Parliament in a thinly veiled criticism that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Even America's closest allies began distancing themselves from the Vietnam conflict. Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau openly criticized American bombing campaigns, while Australian Prime Minister John Gorton faced growing domestic pressure to withdraw the small contingent of troops his country had sent to support the American effort. The contrast was stark and embarrassing. While American forces struggled to defend their own embassy from guerrilla fighters, European allies were quietly suggesting that perhaps the world's most powerful military didn't understand the conflict it was fighting. The image of American invincibility, carefully cultivated since World War II, was crumbling on television screens worldwide. Soviet and Chinese propaganda departments couldn't have scripted a better outcome. The sight of communist forces attacking the American embassy provided perfect material for anti-American broadcasts throughout the developing world. Every image of urban warfare in Saigon became evidence that the capitalist superpower was losing to peasant revolutionaries. The paper tiger has been exposed, declared Radio Beijing in broadcasts that reached across Asia and Africa. The American imperialists who claim to be invincible cannot even protect their own diplomats from the heroic Vietnamese people. Third world nations that had been courted by both superpowers during the Cold War began reassessing their alignments. If America couldn't win a war against a small agricultural country, what did that say about American power and reliability as an ally? The domino theory that had justified American involvement was working in reverse. Allies were falling away from the United States. United Nations debates became forums for criticizing American conduct in Vietnam. Countries that had remained neutral in the Cold War now felt emboldened to condemn American bombing campaigns and military tactics. The moral authority that America had claimed as leader of the free world was evaporating under international scrutiny. European intellectuals and journalists who had long admired American democracy and values, began writing scathing critiques of American imperialism. The same magazines and newspapers that had praised American leadership during the Marshall Plan now published articles comparing American tactics in Vietnam to colonial oppression. NATO allies refused to provide even symbolic support for the Vietnam effort, despite intense American pressure. The alliance that had been built to contain Soviet expansion was fracturing over America's Asian War. European leaders worried that American obsession with Vietnam was weakening Western defenses against the real Soviet threat in Europe. The credibility gap that was destroying Johnson's presidency at home was also undermining American diplomacy abroad. Foreign governments that had trusted American intelligence assessments now questioned every briefing and report. If American officials would lie to their own people about war progress, why should foreign allies believe them about anything? Most damaging was the growing perception that America was becoming the aggressor in the Cold War rather than the defender of freedom. The images of American firepower destroying Vietnamese cities played directly into Soviet propaganda narratives about American militarism and imperialism. International public opinion shifted decisively against American involvement. Protests in London, Paris, and Tokyo drew hundreds of thousands of demonstrators demanding an end to American bombing. The global anti-war movement that emerged after Tet gave communist propaganda efforts credibility they had never achieved through their own efforts. The psychological victory that Tet had achieved was becoming a diplomatic disaster that would haunt American foreign policy for decades. The superpower that had rebuilt Europe and contained Soviet expansion was now seen as a declining empire trapped in an unwinnable war against a determined enemy. America's global reputation would never fully recover from the images of Tet. The world had watched the most powerful military in history struggle to defend its own installations from guerrilla fighters, and the lesson was clear. American power had limits that even America didn't understand. Richard Nixon walked into the Oval Office on January 20, 1969, inheriting the most toxic political situation any president had faced since the Civil War. The Tet Offensive had destroyed his predecessor's credibility, shattered public support for the Vietnam War, and left America deeply divided against itself. Nixon had promised voters a secret plan to end the conflict, but the reality was far more complicated than campaign rhetoric. The new president faced an impossible strategic puzzle. American forces in Vietnam numbered over 540,000 troops, the largest military commitment since World War II. Withdrawal would be seen as defeat by communist forces who had already demonstrated their ability to strike anywhere in South Vietnam. But escalation was politically impossible after Tet had proven that military victory was unachievable under existing strategy. Nixon's solution was characteristically devious and ultimately self-destructive. Publicly, he announced a policy of Vietnamization, gradually turning combat responsibilities over to South Vietnamese forces while slowly reducing American troop levels. Privately, he authorized massive bombing campaigns against Cambodia and Laos that were hidden from Congress and the American people. The secret bombing campaign, codenamed Operation Menu, dropped more explosives on neutral Cambodia than America had used in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger believed they could force North Vietnam to negotiate by threatening to escalate the war beyond Vietnamese borders. They were wrong. The policy contradictions were staggering. Nixon was simultaneously promising peace while secretly expanding the war, reducing American ground forces while massively increasing air attacks, and negotiating with communist representatives in Paris while bombing their supply lines in neighboring countries. The duplicity that had characterized American Vietnam policy since the beginning was reaching new levels under Nixon. The draft lottery system, implemented in December 1969, was Nixon's attempt to reduce domestic opposition by making military service more equitable. Instead of allowing college deferments and other exemptions that primarily benefited middle-class families, the lottery randomly selected young men for service based on their birth dates. The policy backfired by making the war's human costs more visible to suburban families who had previously been insulated from the conflict. Vietnamization proved to be a cruel joke played on both American soldiers and South Vietnamese forces. ARVN units that had collapsed during Tet were somehow expected to take over combat operations from American troops. The same government that couldn't defend its own cities was supposed to defeat an enemy that had humiliated the world's most powerful military. American soldiers trapped in this impossible situation faced the nightmare of fighting in a war their own government was trying to end. Morale collapsed as troops realized they might be the last Americans to die for a cause their commanders no longer believed in. Drug use skyrocketed, discipline broke down, and incidents of fragging, soldiers killing their own officers, became disturbingly common. The Paris peace talks that began in 1968 dragged on for years without meaningful progress. North Vietnamese negotiators understood that time was on their side. Every month that passed brought more American casualties, more domestic protests, and more political pressure on Nixon to end American involvement. They could afford to wait while Nixon's political position deteriorated. The Kent State shootings in May 1970 demonstrated how completely Nixon had misread the political situation. When National Guard troops killed 4 student protesters, the anti-war movement exploded with renewed fury. College campuses across the country shut down in protest, and even moderate Americans began questioning whether their own government was becoming the enemy of democratic dissent. Nixon's secret expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos eventually became public knowledge, triggering congressional investigations and impeachment threats. The president who had promised to restore trust in government was caught lying about the war, just as his predecessor had been. The credibility gap that destroyed Johnson's presidency was now consuming Nixon as well. The tragic irony was that Nixon understood better than most politicians that the Vietnam War was unwinnable. His private conversations, later revealed on White House tapes, showed a president who knew the conflict was destroying American credibility and dividing the country. But political considerations prevented him from simply withdrawing, trapping him in the same strategic dead end that had destroyed Johnson. By 1972, American troop levels had dropped to under 70,000, but the war continued through massive bombing campaigns that killed more Vietnamese civilians than ever before. Nixon had inherited an impossible situation from Johnson, but his secretive and duplicitous response made the crisis even worse. The Tet Offensive's political shockwaves were still reverberating through American politics 4 years after the attacks ended. The war that the Tet Offensive had exposed as unwinnable dragged on for 7 more bloody years. Nixon's promise of peace with honor became a cruel joke as American involvement slowly wound down through a series of strategic retreats disguised as the diplomatic victories. The psychological defeat that began in January 1968 would culminate in the most humiliating military withdrawal in American history. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords finally provided Nixon with a face-saving exit from Vietnam. The agreement allowed remaining American forces to withdraw while supposedly guaranteeing South Vietnam's independence. Everyone involved knew the accords were meaningless, a temporary ceasefire that would collapse the moment American support ended. But Nixon needed political cover for abandonment, and the North Vietnamese were willing to provide it in exchange for American withdrawal. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973, but the war continued without them. South Vietnamese forces, supposedly strengthened by years of Vietnamization, immediately began losing territory to communist attacks. The ARVN units that had collapsed during Tet proved no more effective when fighting alone than they had been with American support. Congress, traumatized by years of presidential deception about the war, passed legislation prohibiting any future American military involvement in Southeast Asia. The War Powers Act of 1973 was a direct response to the credibility gap that had destroyed 2 presidencies. Never again would presidents be able to wage undeclared wars without congressional oversight. But the most devastating blow to South Vietnam came from an unexpected source: the American economy. The oil crisis of 1973 and growing inflation made foreign aid politically impossible. Congress slashed military assistance to Saigon just as North Vietnamese forces were preparing their final offensive. America was abandoning its ally not just militarily, but economically. The end came with stunning swiftness in the spring of 1975. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through South Vietnam's defenses like they were made of paper. The same ARVN forces that American advisors had trained for over a decade simply melted away when faced with determined communist assault. Cities that had been defended by American blood fell without serious resistance. President Gerald Ford, who had inherited Nixon's mess after Watergate destroyed another presidency, could only watch helplessly as America's South Vietnamese allies collapsed. The domino theory that had justified American involvement was proving correct in reverse, but the dominoes were falling toward communist victory, not American triumph. The final humiliation came on April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The city that American forces had defended during Tet was now falling to the same enemy that had attacked the embassy 7 years earlier. The circular nature of the defeat was impossible to ignore. The helicopter evacuations from the American embassy rooftop became the defining image of American failure in Vietnam. Desperate South Vietnamese allies clung to helicopter skids as American diplomats fled the country they had promised to defend. The embassy that had been attacked during Tet was now being abandoned as communist forces approached Saigon Center. Thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with American forces faced certain death or imprisonment under the new communist government. The boat people who fled Vietnam in the following years were living testimony to the consequences of American abandonment. Families who had trusted American promises of protection found themselves refugees with nowhere to go. The Strategic Hamlet Program, the pacification efforts, the Hearts and Minds campaigns, all the counterinsurgency tactics that American experts had developed to fight guerrilla warfare proved worthless when the population didn't support the government being defended. The lesson that should have been learned from Tet was finally being taught through total defeat. The fall of Saigon marked the end of American credibility in Southeast Asia. Thailand, the Philippines, and other regional allies began reassessing their relationships with a superpower that had proven unable to protect its friends. The domino effect that American intervention was supposed to prevent was happening anyway, but in the context of American weakness rather than strength. Most tragically, the long road to defeat proved that every American death after Tet had been meaningless. The war that was already lost in January 1968 continued for 7 more years, claiming thousands of additional American lives for no strategic purpose. The Tet Offensive had revealed the truth that took 7 years to acknowledge. America couldn't win a war that the Vietnamese people didn't want won. The Pentagon Papers, published by the New York Times in 1971, revealed the full extent of government deception about Vietnam. The classified documents showed that officials had known the war was unwinnable as early as 1965, 3 years before Tet exposed that reality to the American public. Presidents Johnson and Nixon had continued sending young men to die for a cause their own advisors admitted was hopeless. The intelligence failures that made Tet possible weren't aberrations. They were symptoms of a military culture that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Field commanders who reported enemy strength accurately found their careers stalled, while those who provided optimistic assessments were promoted. The system rewarded deception and punished honesty, guaranteeing that future conflicts would repeat the same mistakes. American military doctrine remained stubbornly focused on conventional warfare despite Vietnam's lessons about guerrilla conflicts. The army that had been humiliated by peasant fighters armed with AK-47s continued planning for tank battles against Soviet forces in Europe. Technology was still seen as the solution to every military problem, even though all the firepower in the world couldn't defeat an enemy that had popular support. The all-volunteer military that replaced the draft system after Vietnam created a dangerous separation between civilian society and military service. Middle-class families who had opposed the war when their sons faced conscription became indifferent to military adventures that only affected working-class volunteers. The shared sacrifice that had once constrained presidential war-making was replaced by professional soldiers who bore the entire burden of combat. Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973, supposedly preventing future presidents from waging undeclared wars without legislative approval. But the law was written with so many loopholes that determined executives could easily circumvent its restrictions. Presidents would learn to launch military operations quickly and present Congress with fait accompli situations that were politically impossible to reverse. The credibility gap that destroyed 2 presidencies became institutionalized rather than eliminated. Future administrations developed sophisticated media management techniques to control information flow and shape public perception of military operations. Instead of learning to tell the truth about war, government officials became better at managing lies. The lesson that hearts and minds matter more than body counts was quickly forgotten as military planners returned to their obsession with firepower and technology. The counterinsurgency tactics that had failed so spectacularly in Vietnam were repackaged and applied to conflicts in Central America, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. Each new war was supposed to be different, but the fundamental misunderstanding of guerrilla warfare remained unchanged. Intelligence agencies that had completely missed the Tet preparations continued operating with the same assumptions and biases that had caused their failures. The CIA and military intelligence services blamed their Vietnam mistakes on insufficient resources rather than flawed analysis, leading to massive budget increases that didn't improve their understanding of foreign enemies. Most tragically, the human cost of ignoring Vietnam's lessons would be paid by future generations of American soldiers. The same strategic arrogance that had trapped America in Southeast Asia would later bog down American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. Different enemies, different terrain, same fundamental misunderstanding of what military power could and couldn't accomplish. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower had warned about in 1961 emerged from Vietnam stronger than ever. Defense contractors who had profited from the war's escalation successfully argued that defeat resulted from insufficient weapons and technology rather than flawed strategy. Military spending continued growing even after the war's end, creating vested interests in future conflicts. The psychological impact of Vietnam defeat created a dangerous overcompensation in American foreign policy. The Vietnam Syndrome, reluctance to use military force abroad, was seen as weakness rather than wisdom. Future presidents would feel compelled to prove American strength through military action, leading to interventions that repeated Vietnam's mistakes on smaller scales. The media revolution that began during Tet coverage created an adversarial relationship between press and government that continues today. But instead of producing more honest reporting about war, the conflict led to more sophisticated government propaganda efforts designed to manipulate rather than inform public opinion. The Pentagon learned to wage information warfare against its own citizens. Perhaps most damaging was the failure to understand that military victory means nothing without political legitimacy. American forces could win every battle and still lose wars when the populations they claimed to be defending didn't support the governments they were fighting for. This lesson would be relearned painfully in Iraq, where tactical military success couldn't create political stability. The Tet Offensive had provided a masterclass in the limitations of military power, but American leaders chose to ignore the curriculum. The same strategic thinking that had failed in Vietnam would be applied to future conflicts with predictably disastrous results. The lessons were there to be learned, but learning them would have required admitting that American power had limits that even Americans didn't want to acknowledge. The Tet Offensive proved that military victories mean nothing without political support at home. A single coordinated attack destroyed years of optimistic government propaganda and taught Americans to question official claims about foreign wars. The psychological shockwave that began in Saigon ultimately changed how America fights wars and how citizens view their government's promises about military success.